Good afternoon. Greetings to everybody else joining in. What are the chances of survival in the post-apocalyptic GDPR world? A very, very interesting topic, and we've got some interesting panelists, including myself and everybody else in the audience joining in. Do take part, regardless of where you are. GDPR most likely does or is going to impact you or your business. So without too much ado, we've got quite a lot of topics and things to talk about. We have several surveys which we're going to also kind of push down your screen. Please do take part. Very important we get your feedback, you get your say, use the questions from the audience to communicate with us, and at the end of the debate, at the end of the discussion, please do leave us constructive feedback on how we can improve and what else you want to see. Okay, we always go along with this. Chris Payne, I'm going to obviously introduce him a bit later. We talk about alternative titles, what we were thinking before we got to the post-apocalyptic GDPR title. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough. So I'm definitely assure you it's Amar Singh here. One of them was not another GDPR webinar. No, please don't do what the lady's doing there. This is a very, very interesting one, and we bring you, very interesting panelists. If you haven't thought about Bitcoin, maybe now. If you don't want to do anything about GDPR and you really want to pay the regulators all your hard-earned money, now is the time to probably buy Bitcoin, or maybe too late. And here we have everyone on this call today. One on the blue turban, aka that's me, Amar. We have Chris Payne, CEO and founder of Advanced Cyber Solutions, and he loves to talk on GDPR. We will stop him if he gets too long. Just kidding, Chris. Mark Leiser, I know you've dialed in. Mark, good to have you there. Mark, he's a lecturer in law, a very good friend. I met him the other day, and you can see the wonderful titles he has. Yes, he does teach law, and he also is focusing on GDPR. Tom, CTO, Chief Technical Officer at NetConsent, and again, joining in to share his insights on what may happen, but also what we can do. And Joe, also from NetConsent, who is going to share his insights. And to all candidates, if I do interrupt you, nothing personal. We just have Bright Talk shuts the webinar on time. And straight to the audience, final request, please. There's a fire alarm do run off. You can listen to the webinar later. But do take questions and do take part in the surveys. Chris, shall I put the survey out? First one. How ready is your organization, or if you have multiple organizations, for May 2018? The first one is a really good one, Chris. Thank you. But poorly prepared, somewhat prepared. We will be ready in time. We are currently ready. So again, to the audience, whilst we start discussing and debating, do please take part in all the surveys. No answer is the right answer. Sorry, no answer is a wrong answer in any of these surveys. We just want to know what this is. Snake oil. I mean, I've got GDPR cream that I'm preparing to start selling, but let's go into snake oil. Chris Payne, what's your view, sir?
Yeah, this is we put this into the slide pack at the very last minute before coming on air. This is something that I can't claim credit for. This has been picked up of a contact that I have on LinkedIn. They received this email yesterday morning. It says, if you're worried about the GDPR, don't be. All you need to do is make sure that you're not infected with malware, and they can help you with that. You can avert all of your risk under GDPR if you just go for their AV scan, I guess is what it is, which I hope most of the people joining us on the call don't believe or are not signing up to, but it speaks to a wider point. There is a bit of fatigue in the industry. We talked about not another GDPR webinar. There is a bit of fatigue in our industry around GDPR, but ultimately, a lot of the messaging out there is a little bit fake.
Yeah, Mark, thanks for joining in. Mark, what is, we will touch on snake oil briefly, but what is being prepared for GDPR in your opinion?
What is being prepared?
Yes, we're looking at the survey, that you may not actually have access to right now, but majority of the respondents saying, are they prepared, are saying they're somewhat prepared for GDPR.
Right. No, I think the big issue with GDPR that organizations have failed to kind of grasp is that it places a series of legal obligations that you are most likely to be under the Data Protection Act, but it actually requires you to maintain records of personal data and processing, whereby previously you may have just processed the data. If you are a processor, if you are handling data for the behalf of a controller, or you're a controller yourself, it has specific obligations to ensure that the people that you are contracting with to do the processing are data protection compliant.
Sorry to interrupt you. What I really like the word here is an observation. Rephrase is the word you use, which is obligation. And I think, obligations don't begin or end on a certain day. Obligations normally, in perpetuity, right?
Yeah. The thing is that under the new GDPR, there are obligations on data processors that ensure legal liability is placed on you if you're responsible for a breach. And so that is the big difference, is that if you are not taking reasonable steps to ensure that your organization is compliant, and that means reasonable technical and organizational measures to ensure that your organization is compliant, then you become legally liable. And that is a huge difference, because the big numbers that have been floating around are 4% of global turnover.
No, totally.
Up to, or 20 million, or whatever the...
Excellent. Now I'm going to bring you make a very interesting point, Mark. Yeah, I know that there are figures which are definitely, obligation and figures are going to be an interesting mix. Dom, what are your thoughts in terms of snake oil, and the reality is, sadly, and this particular email is just one string of evidence we inserted because we found, Chris Payne found someone sharing this particular real email. Vendors are, and everybody almost, if I may, is trying to sell authoritative binary solutions, if I may. And the reality is that no one's an expert on GDPR right now. But yes, as Mark was saying, legal obligations. But Tom, snake oil, what are your thoughts, your comments?
I think everyone is jumping on the back of GDPR, and personally, I'm getting quite bored of hearing how vendor X can all of a sudden solve your GDPR issues. GDPR is real. It's going to affect every organisation that processes personal data, and that's just about every organisation in the world that processes data, because they have to process data in order to generate revenue. There are very few organisations that GDPR doesn't actually affect. That said, I think GDPR is more about making sure that you have processes in place in order to comply with the regulatory controls that are being imposed under the GDPR, or whatever the different variations of it are going to be coming into play in the US and in the Far East and so on, because there are versions of GDPR coming in all the way around the world.
All around the world, yeah.
Yeah, it's inevitable that they will all effectively complement one another in some way, because I think all of us as individuals want to make sure that our data is being protected and not being sold off to third parties. So
no, totally, and I kind of wonder. I'm going to take this from Mark and going to use it. I think the key word here is obligation, and I don't think, and I think Chris, hopefully you agree, and hopefully everyone agrees who's listening in. It's not a point problem. It's not a tactical problem that's going to be here one day and disappear tomorrow. What GDPR is saying, you have to inherently consider it your obligation. And interestingly, Chris, do you want to read that comment from the audience, which is referring to this particular marketing email, which is really interesting, the comment from the audience.
Yeah, I'm so glad we're going to read this, actually, because I did notice it in the console when it was submitted. But somebody from the audience has said that actually this post has been replied to. So whoever sent out this message, we know who it is, but I don't think we should mention who it is on there. They've actually replied to this on LinkedIn today, but seems to be a little bit bemused as to why it's incorrect or what's wrong with it. So I guess lesson not learned.
Yeah. Joe, again, like I said, I do apologize to the panelists if I have to interrupt you. Joe, did you have any comment on this particular aspect of folks kind of trying to sound authoritative on something that no one really knows what it is about at the moment fully?
I think it's a point that we've all touched on, is that no vendor is offering a GDPR solution. There's nothing that you can take off the shelf which is going to make you GDPR compliant. Working on that idea is an obligation. It's about a business being able to put in the processes in place in order to maintain that level of compliance. That is a cultural thing that business and organisations are going to have to adhere to and grow to live with, rather than taking something off the shelf, putting it in and thinking that's going to be that's going to save the day.
No, totally. Sorry, just quick feedback to the survey, the voting. So yes, 38% are somewhat prepared, 30% will be ready in time, which is interesting. And finally, I think hopefully it's in a cheeky angle. 19% have said, "What is GDPR?" So as long as it's tongue-in-cheek, it's good. Otherwise, it's a bit worried. Pushing out one more survey before we go to the other topics that we're going to talk. How confident are you that your users are well informed? Oops, someone clicked. Did someone? Oh no. Who has accidentally clicked on this? Please do not click. Sorry. I have to take back that survey and click on start voting. Oh, are you sure you want to continue? No, this is wrong. Apologies. Back to the list. How confident are you? Yes, it's already started. That you or your users are well informed about GDPR and how it applies to your job. How confident are you that your users are well informed about the GDPR and how it applies to your job? Okay. This is interesting. What is a GDPR, or rather, what is a breach in GDPR? Let's go with Dom. What do you think first on this? Dom?
Sorry, I put myself on mute. I was talking away. Apologies. So, what do I think of breaches of GDPR? I think what we should possibly ask ourselves is what could constitute a breach. Well, a breach is going to be the mismanagement of personal data, and ultimately someone will bring a claim against an organisation. Now, whether that's a group of people or an individual, they'll bring a claim against an organisation for misuse of their personal data. And that misuse can be by not having the permission to use it. It could be through selling that data nefariously, i.e. without or trying to make a short buck on the side by selling the data to a third party and that being used. And there will be seed data put out there so that people can monitor where databases are going to and how they're flowing around the world. We already know that seed data exists in databases. So I think what is going to constitute a breach of GDPR. I don't think there is a clear list, but it's going to be anybody who mismanages the data that they have access to. So I think the organisation's got to make sure that they are sensible, pragmatic, and serious about how they're controlling the data, whether it's at rest, whether it's in transit, how they're utilising that data, and who has access to that data.
Excellent. Mark, what are your thoughts on what, and this is actually, not many people have a clear, in my opinion, when I talk to customers and potential customers, is what is a breach?
A breach is really easy to define. A breach is a breach of security that leads to the destruction, alteration, the unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data. So what does that mean in real terms? It means if your phone is stolen and you have your emails on your phone, and that includes personal data of your employees, then that would be a potential breach if your phone is not encrypted and password protected. If your hospital records are or inappropriately accessed due to a lack of internal controls. That would be a breach. If somebody lost or left a USB stick lying around that wasn't encrypted, that would be a breach. All of these are breaches, and this is the problem, is that people start thinking, okay, a breach can only happen when there is a hack.
Yes,
and
that's wrong.
Wrong.
Yeah.
It is one of the things that we have to get into people's heads, is that a breach of security is any access that results in an unauthorized disclosure of personal data. So if I have an email and I send it to my boss, and my boss saying, oh, I've been diagnosed with the flu, and my doctor suggests that I should take some time off work. And that email goes to my boss's phone, and then he loses his phone, and somebody accesses that data, then that is a breach of security. That is
excellent. So that's a really interesting point. Thank you, Mark, because Chris Payne and I, we were discussing this, and we came up with something which is really very close to what you're saying. And just to clarify, everyone listening in, hope all of you agree. If you don't shout at the, shout using Bright Talk. Don't shout at the screen because people may think something's wrong. A breach is not a hack. Okay, a breach is not an external cyber criminal trying to only hack you. And the approach to a breach must be, does something impact confidentiality, integrity, availability, and unauthorized access to a data set that is critical or important to you. Use the CIA and A approach, and if any one of those boxes are ticked, then you could possibly have a breach. Mr. Payne, do you want to expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to add any more to what Mark said because he put it so well, but it's a conversation that I sadly have quite frequently with a lot of different customers and people, and even vendors and other types of so-called practitioners in our industry. But I think the problem is that we're so used to having the conversation around cyber espionage, hackers, network breaches, that we just automatically associate the word breach with a network breach. But the difference in the GDPR is it's not related necessarily to external hackers. It's anything related to personal data. It's information security, not network security. So people really need to understand that the idea of a breach in the GDPR is probably a lot wider than many of them assume. Mark put the list together quite well. Just to kind of like underline what he said, it's accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, access to, transmission stored or otherwise processed where it shouldn't be. Those are all cases of breaches which maybe people aren't assuming that they are. So actually, this idea of am I breach proof? Am I ready for the GDPR? Do I have an incident response plan? There's a very real possibility that people are focusing in a very narrow space.
Yeah, Chris, we see that all the time. It's interesting. I've got a presentation I do on GDPR. And by the way, GDPR is no different to organisations than Anti-Money Laundering, Anti-Bribery, Data Protection Act, State Health and Safety Act, and so on. They are all regulatory controls that organisations have to abide by. GDPR just happens to be a ramped-up version of effectively the Data Protection Act. But it's interesting because in Q1 of this year, 56% of data breaches were disclosure in error. That is not malicious, that is disclosure in error. Possibly from an inside threat, or possibly from an inside weakness rather than an inside threat. And there's a brilliant cartoon, a few years old now, it's a picture of a boxing ring, and it says, in this corner we have firewalls, disk encryption, antivirus, and so on and so forth, and in this corner we have Dave. And that is where, it's the insider threat is more, or is greater than the external threat in many instances, many organisations. Some of the big high-profile organisations, they may be a real target for the malicious criminals to try and target, but a lot of our threat is internal, and we need to a lot of our weakness is internal, and we therefore must make sure we address that. The definition of regulation is policy. Is the rules to which the conduct must be applied, and therefore that results in organisations having to have policies and procedures.
Okay, Joe, thanks for that. Just very briefly to summarize, how confident are you that you and all your users are well informed about GDPR and how it applies to your job? 44% are not confident that they are well informed about GDPR and how it applies to their job. 40% are somewhat confident. So I'm going to stop voting there. Audience, thank you for taking part. Next one, has your organization...
Can I actually interrupt you on this point here? Because
Go on.
one of the things that I do not think any organizations, I don't know, let me rephrase that 99% of organizations that I've spoken to are not aware of one of the new obligations that comes about as a result of the GDPR, which is the data subject access request. Now, we have businesses, or we've spoken to businesses, and they've all said they've got 500 customers that they know are their problem customers or their difficult customers, and that they have received sort of letters from lawyers already that they are sort of testing the boundaries of what is going to happen when the data subject access request comes into force. And I think one of the things that we're all talking about is sort of policies, breaches. Are you prepared to actually isolate data relating, all data on a server, all data relating to a data subject? Because that is a significant difference where there's going to be significant hiring in order to meet these obligations. And I don't think people are really prepared to live up with that side of the GDPR obligations.
Very good point, Mark. So I've got something to share here which I've just recently heard, and anyone listening in, do take a moment and write it down. In a recent case, I've got to check it out fully, so I do apologize, but I'll try to bring you information that I've heard. It's not fake news. Let's hope it's not. But we don't cover stupid was a comment by an insurance organization during an actual comment by the CEO of an insurance organization when they were being sued for not paying out. And please do keep this in mind. Insurance is not the panacea. Insurance is not going to pay you the 20 million or the 4% or the 2% of the fine. And any CRO, any CT or anybody in your organization who is trying to imply that insurance will cover stupid, sorry, let me rephrase that, insurance will cover 20% GDPR fines, 20 million. You can quote this thing and do your own research. A CEO of an insurance firm recently, or some time ago, said, we don't cover stupid. And which brings me nicely to my issue with a lot of cyber, if I may, the whole context of cyber and information security is protection, is this word. My issue with the word protection, and those who know and sit on our CIPR courses, I understand why, the GDPR, General Data Protection, I understand why, but the focus is again on protection. My issue is, should organizations, in my opinion, they must start focusing more also on detection and response. And hence we came up with this slide, should it maybe have been called General Data Response Regulation? Because protection, most people, have firewalls and hopefully they're doing something right. But if you study recent cases and, there's so many, the response seems to be, politely put, lacking. Chris, you can expand on this, and then let's go over to Mark and then Tom and Joe.
Well, I think the heart of the point really is that a lot of people are reading the GDPR from a perspective of the administrative penalties for a start, and they focus on that area, and then they do get, I guess, ambushed by an industry that's trying to sell them some kind of silver bullet or snake oil, as we put it earlier on in the presentation. And all of those things tend to be around the protective area of GDPR breaches. But of course, there's a whole swathe of requirements in the GDPR around response. And in fact, I guess to some degree, even if we look at the results of the poll, which I know you haven't given out yet, but if we do accept the wide scope of breaches, and we do accept that most businesses are probably going to suffer some kind of a breach, they need to think about how they're going to respond to that, whether it be small or large or affecting data subjects or not. There needs to be an adequate response plan. And quite often when it comes down to evaluating the behavior of businesses after a breach, it is based on that response. I mean, nothing to do with the GDPR, but look at Equifax. Their response was terrible, and I think almost everybody would agree their response is terrible, and that's how they're going to be judged going forward, not what protective controls they had in place or what defenses they had, but simply how they reacted once they had a breach.
Mark, what are your thoughts?
I have to disagree with you that the right thing to do is to call this the response.
That's fine.
Regulation.
Go on.
Because the GDPR establishes significant new rights for people which are not response relevant. So the right to be informed, the right of erasure, the right of data portability. I mean, these are all obligations that are going to have significant business impacts. The rights related to algorithmic processing and profiling. I mean, all of these are significant new things. The other thing that you've overlooked here is that there's still a significant amount of business that handle personal data in paper form. And
very true.
And so what happens is that somebody says, okay, for example, I used to work for an organization that their policy, I won't name them, but their policies were that you would self-certify your illness, for example, if you were on work. But then you would have to drop off a paper evidence to a mailbox. And oftentimes that paper evidence would just be sitting on somebody's desk. Now, if that was sensitive medical data, obviously that is sensitive personal data because it's medical evidence, then that causes new obligations potentially for liability to be imposed that has nothing to do with responses. It's simply about, hey, somebody then learns that somebody else maybe has an illness or a disease and then publicizes it. Oh, he was having chemo today. Well, if that person has a right to privacy about the fact.
Oh, totally. And Mark, if I may, in my defense, I guess I'm saying yes, obligation is 100% important.
Yeah.
And that's why I picked up on that word. I think obligation is key. And to if I may just rephrase what you're saying, it's not only digital. You better focus on any information and protect it.
Yeah.
Agreed 100%.
So, but the point being is that I can't remember which one of the other callers made it, but it's not just about breaches, and we're still focusing this idea that everything has to be electronic. Well, I think what's going to happen is to get down on the paper vulnerabilities, people are then going to say, oh, right, we'll get people to upload their evidence, and then you've got the breach of the network as being the primary focus. But that then becomes the response. But if we focus solely on the electronic aspects of the Data Protection Act, then all the paper stuff gets ignored. And that goes back to changing the entire culture of an organization.
Totally. And it goes back to obligation, isn't it? I love that word because I think obligation has a very deep meaning in this. I'm just going to just read some responses here. 18 to 20%. Have in this question suffered a breach at least once or multiple times. No, but we wouldn't know anyway, that is 9%. And don't know is 33%, 38%. So this is, again, interesting data. Going back to issuing another survey question before we carry on with this, are organizations focusing too much on the external threat of breach than possibly of internal-led breaches? Are organizations focusing too much on external threat of breach than possibility of internal led breach? Tom, do you think organizations focusing on, as we were discussing earlier, the cyber threat from outside? Dom, Joe, you there?
Sorry, guys, I thought I'd take myself off mute again. I think most organisations are focusing on the cybersecurity, the external aspect, simply because of the marketing that's going on around it. You know, if you look at the marketing that Chris has got there, I mean, I fundamentally, if anybody falls for that, then they need to be really questioning themselves. But I think every single vendor is jumping on the back of GDPR. If you only have to look on LinkedIn, and every single vendor is saying it is the solution for GDPR. And so that's where, you know, a lot of the thought process is going to, well, how do they fix my GDPR? Rather than actually, we need to look at the internal threat, the insider, and manage that. And I think just one other thing I'd just like to mention as well. The ICO is putting together a plethora of tools to help organisations to comply. They are publicly saying that we do not want to be going out as the policeman trying to catch people out and find people. Yes, there will be fines in place. However, the Information Commissioner, if you look at their website, there is a whole training platform available on their website, or a series of training material that's available free for use from the ICO. So the ICO is helping people to comply with GDPR. But in parallel to that, you need to make sure that all of your employees and subjects within your organisation, the processing data, have actually seen that content.
No, and I think this, again, ties in with, I think, what Mark was mentioning a little bit earlier, just before this, was, it's just not external digital threat. It is paper-based threat also. It's the insider, and this is the question, and the feedback that's coming in from the audience is very interesting to the question that are we focusing too much on the external element, and 66% of those who have filled in the answers have said that, they believe it is too much of a focus on external threat of a breach rather than maybe looking inside the organization. I'm going to have to take a look at some of the questions and comments. The first one says GDPR must be organization specific. Without doing the organization-wide analysis, no organization can come close. Yes, okay, agreed. Next one, interesting point about internal human error. I consult on both data and HR. It is a function. HR struggles to show value a lot across. What are your thoughts on HR role in implementing and embedding this ramped up version of regulation? That's a good question. What are your thoughts on HR implementing and embedding this ramped up version of regulation into everyday business behavior? Let me quickly go to Mark, a quick answer on this, Mark. I think it's a good question, and then let's take it to the wider audience.
The long and short of it is that HR is going to be the fundamental inside node in any business organization that has to implement this this new regulation throughout the organization. I think a quick answer on this is going to be about training staff to understand that people have a right to privacy and end the sort of gossip culture that sometimes plagues some businesses. Taking particular care and practice, making sure people come in and understand that part of their role is to follow this regulation regardless of what their job title is, and that data protection and implementing the GDPR is a mindset as opposed to a duty, like a typical job duty, like making sure that your desk is clean.
No, totally.
People tend to just kind of.
Hey, yeah, okay. Mark, you and I agree more than we disagree. So
yeah,
I agree.
I agree on this one.
Then we agree again. I think I think this is maybe HR's opportunity to shine. I have nothing against HR. I love HR. I have another meaning of the acronym HR, but I'm not going to say it today. But HR, I think, has the opportunity of a lifetime. It's a very brilliant question here. The opportunity to really shine and drive the value of privacy, and be the critical node in closing maybe and instilling this privacy-led obligational approach to privacy. Brilliant. Yeah, very good question, Mr. Payne. And then we'll go to Lord. Rather, Dom, if you don't mind, you go very briefly on this, and then Joe, and then Chris. Yeah,
I just wanted to say, this is about users' behavior within employees' behavior within the organisation. And more and more people see GDPR as and Mark put it perfectly just a moment ago, as it's about electronic data, it's about an IT thing. GDPR is an IT thing, and therefore it ends up in information security and within the IT department. GDPR is way more than that. GDPR is about human behavior and humans making sure that they handle personal data correctly, and therefore I firmly believe it is an HR issue that should be driven by the HR department in terms of changing behaviour and changing culture within the organisation, as well as the IT side as well. I think that's a very, very, very good point from the audience there, and
excellent, yes.
Follows up on what Mark said.
I think the other thing about HR is that their role is going to be different because employees are embedded with a whole new slew of rights. Data rectification, for example, the right to be forgotten, the information that will be provided to data subjects. We already kind of touched on that. It is a more detailed set of information to be provided to employees. So where HR is going to be really maybe even struggling to adapt, they're going to be the first departments that kind of get hit by this, because if an employee has a complaint made against them, for example, and then they're vindicated, then they're going to have the right of rectification. They're also going to have the right to change some of the information that's being held against their name, which really wasn't maybe an opportunity for them to do before. And then obviously where there has been a significant practical challenge is where personal data is backed up in maybe an off-site system somewhere. And that right to rectification and the right to be forgotten, they have now the obligation to delete that personal data, and how an HR will have to come up with some sort of plan on how to make sure that happens.
Okay, I'm lucky I'm not HR after everything that you shared with us, Mark. But to the person who asked this question, thank you. Good to have your name. We can give you and shout out your name. But very good question, Joe. Briefly, what are your thoughts on this? Do you agree HR, it's time for them to shine?
Exactly.
Yes,
there's a lot of good points being made. And I think the sort of key thing is there's a whole new regulation coming in to implement. But the key job for HR is going to be, how do you make that consumable for your end users? Because it's not just a case of transmitting and sending out that information, but how are you going to make that consumable for the layman when it comes to GDPR in that organisation, to get their buy-in and to get them following along with that.
Excellent. Chris, before you give the answer, just share with the earlier vote, on the answers from the earlier survey, and then answer the question on the HR. Chris?
Yeah, sorry. You want me to share the answer, or do you want me to answer
no,
the question?
About focusing too much on external threats. Share that with the audience, and then,
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So 70% we've had, actually, so a rather high vote for yes. There is too much of a focus on the external threat with regard to a breach. 20% no, and 8% don't know. So, we were talking about this at the beginning of the call, what defines a breach, and I guess to some degree we were trying to demonstrate to people that it's much wider than they think, and that it certainly does involve more than just external actors, and I guess either we have very enlightened audience, or maybe we've taught them something today.
Excellent, yes. So shout out for Kim Bradford. Very good question. Okay. So, Dom, I'm going to take you on, and it says on this interesting statistic.
Sorry, Amar, we can barely hear you again. It's gone really muffled. Sorry.
My apologies. Sorry. I thought I had a loud voice, but it's just me. I apologize. 60%, Dom, this is your chance now. 60% of senior IT execs regard staff as the biggest threat to GDPR adherence.
Sorry, Amar. I couldn't understand that.
Sorry, Dom, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, there was a bit of echo there again. I do apologize.
Yeah.
Maybe the phone lines are playing up. There's an interesting survey about 60% of senior IT execs regarding staff as the biggest threat. It goes back to the internal side of the debate. What are your thoughts?
I think that's probably an underestimate. As we said at the beginning, 56% of data breaches in Q1 this year were disclosure and error. That's an area that we can address, we can mitigate. Yes, you spend all of your money at the moment and all of your security budget on firewalls and perimeter security, cloud security, endpoint enforcement, and so on and so forth. But very few organizations spend any money on the weakest link in the whole process, which is the users. And if we can... I think 60% is probably around about right, maybe 70%, should be looking at their internal users, the weakest link. There was a very interesting point from one of the audience a moment ago about a lot of organisations in the country are very small, and sub 9 staff, micro companies. Some of those small companies process a huge amount of data. Others don't. Other larger organisations don't process so much huge data. So I think it will balance out. But I think the internal threat, the internal users, sorry, I'm not going to say threat, I'm going to say weakness. The internal weakness is a massive area that really needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed very fast. It doesn't need to cost much. There's plenty of information and plenty of user awareness content available on the net that's freely available for people. So, it just needs action.
Okay, Dom, before I go on, sorry, just a couple of things. Someone has asked, you mentioned a GDPR pack. So that is actually from our website. We mentioned it briefly, it's cm-alliance.com. I'm going to mark that as answered. Thank you. And there's some free, very interesting videos that Chris Payne and myself have done, and we'll get others involved very soon. If internal threat is the issue, that is from Mr. Colson. Hello, Stuart Colson. If internal threat is the issue, then why are the staff feeling they should cripple their companies? Maybe general culture, not security culture, is the issue.
Can I come back on that a second, Amar?
Yeah, please do.
I think there's a chasm in the relationship between staff and the security departments within organisations that needs to be mended, and needs mending very quickly. We have a presentation called The Unhappy Marriage between users and the IT security department. I think people or users within the organisation either think that people in security think they're stupid, or that if they go and report a security breach, they'll get fired immediately. And there's not a culture within the organisation that encourages people to report security incidents, to report security threats. Every time you get on the tube or every time you get on a train, there's a public announcement that says, please keep your eyes and ears out. If you see anything suspicious, contact a member. We need, as the transport function within this country needs the eyes and the ears of everybody out there to make it function. And that is no different to a security department in an organisation. But I think there is a massive void between those two that needs mending.
Thank you. Dom, thanks. I'm sorry to interrupt you, like I said.
No worries.
Survey question for the audience. What represents the biggest threat to falling foul, a very good question, of the GDPR? Please take part. What represents the biggest threat to falling foul of the GDPR? And Mark, I'm just going to read out these questions, and then we're going to come and see what you think. The question is, what is the biggest threat to falling foul of GDPR? We've got accidental user breach, which I think may be, external threats, poor IT systems, interesting, management's lack of understanding the risk of GDPR, or other. Mr. Liza, what do you think? One answer, quick one.
Management.
Management, okay. I actually support management. Right now, 63% are supporting us. Chris Payne, one answer.
Agreed, it's management. I think it's got to start from the top.
Okay. Don, one answer.
It's management to drive behaviour, change of behaviour. Absolutely.
Okay. Joe.
Yeah, full house. It has just got to fall on the management side of things.
5 out of 5. We all are in agreement. This is a good webinar, folks. 66% of those taking part actually agree with us. It's going down a bit, it's going up. But I think if I may, if I had two choices, I would possibly say the accidental human error is also going to be an interesting reason why people do fall foul of GDPR, and people are not choosing any other options here. This is really fascinating. 68% of the audience, and let me just read some questions. More a comment, sorry, from someone. Could it be you, Kim, again? We've just sent out emails requesting employees to utilize encrypted email when transferring. HIPAA, anyone who doesn't know, HIPAA is health regulations in America, and he or she says, wow, did we get negative feedback and complaints that this would negatively affect productivity and student, maybe just gave away your job there or your company, student retention. Unbelievable. Any suggestions on how to address this in a politically correct manner? This is a very good point. We sent out emails requesting. Sorry. Hello.
I've got a.
Yeah.
Maybe
give me
so
1 second.
Yeah,
sorry, let me just repeat the question one more, very briefly. We sent out emails requesting employees to utilize encrypted email when transferring sensitive data. They got a negative feedback and complaints that it would affect productivity. Any suggestions on how to address? A short answer, please, Tom. We've got to go across. Go on. Tom?
Sorry, yes.
Go on. You wanted to say something. A short answer.
No, it wasn't me. I think it was Chris that was. Chris was.
Was it Mark?
Amar, it was me, Chris.
Yep.
Oh, Chris, go on. Yes.
Maybe not so much a suggestion, but a very short anecdote. I've come across a very similar situation in the past when I used to work as a consultant on data classification. And one of the tools available in data classification is every time you send an email, you're prompted to select a classification so that it leaves with the right classification on it. And I also received quite some heavy resistance from the organization that I was working with, to the point where one employee actually calculated the number of additional seconds it took him to send an email, how many emails he sent a day, and what that cumulative time would be. But he was missing the fundamental point, was that it's a risk management tool. It's not there to oppress his ability to do his job. It's essentially there to help and enhance the organization that he's working for. So just a slight anecdote to add to that. That's not a unique situation. That does happen in other places.
Yeah, and it's a good point. My answer to this is, in addition to what you are saying, is yes, maybe show extra love and care to the folks who are handling ultra-sensitive information, but also try to make digital security transparent. I don't know if there is one single answer on how to do that. We could be here for a long time, but to answer the question, anyhow to address a politically correct manner, try to make it transparent so that people don't have to go through hoops to try to do something. Mark Liza, what do you think on this? Very brief answer.
I don't think you have to be politically correct. You just say you have a legal obligation. Yep. I mean, this is the point. The GDPR has extra-jurisdictional effect. I imagine that anybody that's under FERPA, PCI, or HIPAA data was going to encapsulate some European citizens that are empowered with fundamental rights, and that those citizens, if we want to be dealing with them, we have a legal obligation under the GDPR to take reasonable organizational and technical measures to protect these users' data. And if you make an organizational change, then you don't have to worry about it being politically correct when you have a legal obligation.
Okay, Mark, I love this answer. And whoever, again, no name, please do put your name. We can give you a good shout, good question. And I do agree, actually, it's no longer possibly the time to be politically correct, because GDPR is not about political correctness. It's about obligation. I've taken that from you, Mark. It's now mine. No, but totally agree. I think actually, why are you looking to be politically correct when the regulator does come knocking on your door, he or the regulator is not going to be politically correct about giving you a fine. So take the users on a journey. Very, very good.
I think that's the key point, Amar, which is take the users on a journey, because if you try and enforce something on the users, humans naturally hate change. And there's ways of going about things. If another thing suddenly comes in that is, bang, you can't do this, people will revolt against that. Taking them on a journey, educating them, communicating them why they have to do things, and educating them to help them spot the threats is absolutely key in the whole process.
Okay, thank you. I've got so many other things, and questions are coming in. Quick one, 64% of a very large audience who's taken part in this question, management lack of understanding is going to be the biggest threat to falling foul. Excellent question. Is it realistic for any organization to be GDPR ready by May 2018? Yes or no? Very quick across the panel. Mark, yes or no, realistic GDPR ready?
If you start now, yes. Depending on the size of your organization. I mean, that's the beauty of the GDPR, is that you have standards that are imposed, but there's some flexibility with what is reasonable.
Cool.
Obviously,
and I think,
sorry, just I think the important part is actually making sure the people that you work with and the partners that you work with are also GDPR compliant. And that is that's where a lot of the legal obligations. If you're a data controller, for example, and you're working with people, you need to start thinking about who you're working with and are they GDPR compliant, because that's where the liability is going to lie for data controllers.
Okay, thank you. Quick one again, please. Yes or no, Don? GDPR ready by May 2018?
people don't have a lot of choice about it, but if they're not going to be ready for it, they should have started earlier. It's not something that's come in late and, rushed through. This has been announced for a long time.
Okay, thank you. What about Joe? Yes or no? Will organizations be ready?
Yeah, I mean, I echo Don's point. There has been time to get there. If you're starting now, then maybe not. But this has been around long enough for people to be on that journey already.
Okay, my addition comment to that is define what ready is and try to get there. Chris Payne.
I think the answer is yes, but I think that I'm starting to come to the conclusion that the vast majority of organizations probably won't be ready by that time.
Okay, I had to stop voting, and I'm going to go. I think, again, I would say define ready. Understand there is no 100% readiness in any compliance or regulatory thing. Define what you can do and then get there and then start moving on. Do you currently record your users' understanding of your policies? This is really, again, to me, important. Nothing to do with digital data or physical, but do you have again a transparent or user-based friendly approach to record your users' understanding of your policies, because policies and regulations are very, very interlinked. I've got a couple of things I do want to read out. Mr. Colson, thank you for that. If we don't have, sorry, there's so many questions. Silly question, but no, that was not you, Stuart. Silly question, but can you post a link of the detailed outline for GDPR? Just reach out to us, CMA-Alliance, it's Amar or Chris, and we'll get back to you. Good, Mark, that good question. Thank you. How many companies do you think are taking GDPR seriously? Well, that's one of those questions, and interestingly, are they going to be ready? I think many people are taking seriously. But they don't probably understand the threat. There are too many questions coming in, folks. Hold on one second. Would there be any guidelines for determining value at risk in GDPR? Would there be any guidelines for determining value at risk? Amit, that is going to be our next topic. Thank you for putting your name there. We have a proper webinar in that. We are running out of time. Remember, Bright Talk is going to cut off in about 8 minutes. How many companies? Okay, we don't have end-to-end solution. How many? Okay, sorry, I do apologize, folks. They're just coming in. The issue with GDPR, okay, this is a real story. A primary school in the UK, no technical staff, they have massive sensitive database, no funding from government, consultants charging £600 a day, interesting, to help them. Software to help them costs thousands of pounds. The school cannot become GDPR compliant in time as they don't have the available time. They don't have the budget unless they lose a teacher. How can they be ready? Stuart, very good point, and maybe we could discuss how, and anybody who does want to help, get in touch, and Stuart, I'll get in touch with you also. Good point. But you make a very, and CM Alliance, we try to help us charities also, as much as it for free, and sometimes we charge a very little money. And charities are still facing the same challenge. And I think, Mark, you and I were discussing the whole kind of, silly loop about data retention and recording data, forget me.
Yeah.
The biggest headaches are the weakest organized, if I may, the third sector, the school sector, who are holding the most sensitive information, and no one's helping them. I'm not getting political here, but they are the ones that need the most amount of proper, pragmatic guidance, So, sorry, anybody wants to say anything here? Go on, your chance. Quick ones, please. No? Okay. This is a tick exercise for most organizations. Yes, you mean tick box. How many companies do you think are GD? Okay, sorry, there's too many questions. That's all coming in all at the same time. Kim, yes, thank you for that. Okay, so one more thing I want to kind of give a final thoughts to folks. Don't blame the human, but rather empower them. Superman, Superwoman, whatever, I don't really care, but empower your human employees, as long as we are all human, empower them, give them technology, and whether it's transparent, take them on the journey. It's not, oh, it's a bit muffled, I do apologize. Empower your users, take them on the journey, and don't, and it's not about being politically correct anymore, as Mark has said, and make them aware of the obligations. And I want to leave everyone with a bit of thought over here. And this is more around the whole understanding of the risk you're facing in automatic incident response, etc. Risk management must not be considered the icing on the cake. It's not a protective technology, I understand. It's not a responsive technology, but putting a risk in spreadsheet must not be the focus. You must try to get on top of risk management rather than saying, oh, it's the last thing that I'm going to look at once I buy all my firewalls and malware. I'm sorry, I do have to kind of call it a day. We've got so many questions. 66% currently do not record their users' understanding of policies. Final survey question I'm going to release to the, oh, we're done. Excellent, excellent. I'm going to give a minute each maximum, please, to every panelist. Mark, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go across. Mark, final comments.
I think one of the things that I think businesses need to get a hold of, just very quickly, a big change in the GDPR is the use of consent as grounds for processing personal data. Non-specific consents to processing are unlikely to be considered valid under the GDPR. So you are going to have to go back, and this for those of you that are interested in an HR perspective, one of the areas where they are very directly going to be hit is the use of consent as grounds for processing employee data. And that also goes to the use of consent for processing customer data. You're going to have to go back and re-establish consent. And what you will see is that you will have people questioning whether or not you gave consent. And then the value at risk, maybe the inverse of that, is the harm. You're going to see aspects of harm or complaints of harm coming forward as a result of this. And I think that's the big difference that the GDPR, or the challenge that the GDPR is going to pose to businesses.
Mark, thank you so much. And Mark, I'm going to invite you back. I've got a really interesting suggestion from someone saying, why don't you take the rest of the questions, which are flooding in literally, and let's create a blog and then get everybody else involved and kind of crowdsource the answers. Mark, thank you. Tom, a quick 30 seconds, please, on this.
Yeah, I think the interesting point came up a minute ago about do you keep a log of who's seen what content within your organisation, the policies, etc. The biggest risk is who hasn't seen those, and so it's making sure that you've got a system in place that easily enables you to identify who hasn't seen what the content that you need them to see. And most importantly, what happens when a new starter joins the organisation? How do you make sure that they are automatically embedded into that whole process, and that it's not sent out by email this week, and therefore when a new starter joins next week, they don't get the communication about it from last week because they weren't here.
Thank you. Joe, quick one, 30 seconds, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so again, on this final point, a breach is inevitable. It's how are you going to be able to evidence that you've communicated and tried to give an understanding to your end users. So it's not just a case of recording, those policies going out, but actually being evidence that the efforts have been made to ensure that your end users are understanding, these new policies and procedures.
Okay, Chris, 30 seconds, and then I'll close. Over to you, Chris. 30 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. Just some closing remarks from myself. I think we've got, 6.5 months now to go, and the audience is indicating that quite a few of them maybe aren't ready or don't believe others will be ready. And we were talking about HR earlier on as being a key department. It's a cliche, but we need to talk about it being organisation-wide. I speak to a lot of people who say they've kicked it to their legal team, their IT team, their HR team, but that's not the way to do it, right? We need to embrace this from the top, and it needs to filter down to the whole organisation. We hear too many cases where people just don't know GDPR is coming because they work in, say, marketing.
Okay, folks, I want to thank everyone from the... No, I appreciate that, gentlemen, and thank you so much to all the panelists, all the audience, Kim, Stuart, and the others, Amit, and the others who did not name themselves. We will take all of these questions, put them in a blog. Please do give us constructive feedback. My kind of 5 seconds on this: yes, human, empower the human. Define what is ready. Don't panic. Be pragmatic, paranoid rather than completely paranoid, because I don't think the regulators want blood, if I may, metaphorically. They want to get everyone, and as to quote my good friend Mark, who's here, it's an obligation, and obligations take time, and it's a continuous journey. Thank you to everybody, and we'll keep in touch again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Amar.